This episode of the WP Builds podcast is brought to you by GoDaddy Pro, the home of managed WordPress hosting that includes free domain, SSL, and 24/7 support. Bundle that with the Hub by GoDaddy Pro to unlock more free benefits to manage multiple sites in one place, invoice clients, and get 30% off new purchases. Find out more at go.me/WP Builds. And by Bluehost. Redefine your web hosting experience with Bluehost Cloud. Managed WordPress hosting that comes with lightning-fast websites, 100% network uptime, and 24/7 priority support. With Bluehost Cloud, the possibilities are out of this world. Experience it today at bluehost.com/cloud. And by Omnisend. Do you sell your stuff online? Then meet Omnisend. Yes, that Omnisend. The email and SMS tool that helps you make $73 for every dollar spent. The one that's so good, it's almost boring. Hate the excitement of roller coaster sales? Prefer a steady line going up? Try Omnisend today at omnisend.com. Hello there, and welcome to this episode 3 of the Accessibility Show with Joe Dolson. Hello, Joe. How you doing?
Hello. Glad to be here again. Doing really well.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure to have you back. We're like I said, we're on the 3rd episode. We've done 2 previous ones, which you can find at wpbuilds.com. If you go to the main menu and look in the archives, you'll see there's an accessibility show. Have a look at those 2 episodes. This is the endeavor of this show, but we're kind of just sort of figuring out what's what. The endeavor is to take little bits of websites and give you some actionable, hopefully, content around accessibility, where things succeed, where things fail, and we've had a look at various different things in the past. Today, 2 different topics. We're going to firstly have a look at a couple of websites and just talk about the navigation menus and see how good they can be. That's a nice thing. And then we're going to look at some forms and see how bad they can be. I will just say, firstly, that the endeavor here is absolutely 100% not to sort of smear or besmirch the reputation of these websites. They are just the websites that we picked. And, it's a work in progress, accessibility for many people. So I just want to make that clear at the beginning. Don't come after us with your lawyers, please. That isn't the intention. But Joe, do you want to just give us an intro into you and who you are and what you do for a living and that kind of thing?
Certainly. So I'm Joe Dolson. I am a WordPress core committer and an accessibility consultant. I'm one of the leads for WordPress Accessibility Day, which is an annual conference focusing on accessibility talks. It's a 24-hour event. I do a lot of work with small nonprofit organizations who particularly serve populations of people with disabilities. So I have the incredible luxury of working on accessibility in a space where everybody I'm talking to loves the idea and wants it to succeed.
Nice.
So I have a very nice life there.
Perfect. Well, thank you again for joining us today. Really appreciate it. The plan really is to share Joe's screen. As I said at the start, we're going to look at some navigation menus, some good examples. I will create some show notes. So if you like anything and you want to have a look at them more closely, you can just go to the show notes there and click on the links. We'll just put Joe's screen up. You'll notice that we're kind of bound. We have to make compromises here. In order to fit Joe's screen on this screen, we have to, reduce the size of the website in order to beef up the font size of the inspector and things like that. So be forgiving. The layout that you see may not be the layout that we see, and so on and so forth. But okay, shall we go for it?
Let's do that.
Where are we?
Well, we're starting with childrensrights.org, and we're going to look at their navigation menu. Now, in the last episode, we looked at a whole bunch of navigation menus that were, in one way or another, significant problems. And this one is an example of a menu that's actually pretty good. It's not perfect, and I'll comment briefly on the things that I didn't particularly like about it, but it does have some really important useful things. Namely, if you are navigating it with the keyboard, it's got a very clear focus state. It works to open or close with both the space bar and the enter key. Um, and so everything is clearly labeled. Now, what I didn't like particularly is if you actually inspect the nav region, it is named site navigation in the Aria label. And all that means is that when a user reaches it with a screen reader, it will be announced as navigation region, site navigation. It's just redundant. It's an unnecessary word. Really, all you want there is something that describes what purpose this navigation serves. It does not need to say that it is navigation.
Okay.
And then the other thing about it is that it's got a kind of odd usage of the Aria label attribute elsewhere, in that it's got the Aria label repeated on the unordered list that is actually containing the list items. Uh, and so in here, it's called primary navigation. So the menu itself, for no particular reason, has a slightly different Aria label. Um, This is going to have some kind of uneven experience because some assistive technology will ignore that because it's on an unordered list rather than on the nav item. Others will read it, and then what you'll actually have is something that says that it's site navigation, primary navigation, navigation region,
Got it.
which is
Wow.
a lot of verbiage. None of this is particularly harmful. It's not going to interfere with the user's experience a lot. It's not like this text is being read over and over and over again. It's read once when you enter the region, but it is going to be mildly irritating. However, the important thing is it is labeled. It does have a unique label. It works from the keyboard. It has a clear, visible focus. It's a nice menu.
Would
So
you say that the errors that you just mentioned about the verbiage and the sort of repetition of things that don't need to be repeated, does that feel, in your experience, is somebody sort of just maybe inexperienced and kind of overdoing it, if you know what I mean? They've just got this
yes,
impression that they
yeah,
need to add labels everywhere, where in many cases it's just duplication.
right. It's very much what happens when somebody is the thinking not as a screen reader user, but as a sighted user, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's one of the things that really causes people to put the word navigation in an ARIA label for a navigation menu, is just that visually you're looking at this like, well, I need to be told this is navigation. Well, the screen reader is already being informed that by the very presence of the nav element, which contains that as its semantics. So yeah, it's good thoughts, it's well intentioned, it's just gone a bit over the top.
This is maybe the first time in our 3 shows where the advice is to take things away, not add things in, which is kind of interesting. So, presumably that's an easier job than it is to add things in if you don't know where they belong.
Usually, yes,
Yeah,
indeed.
yeah. Oh,
Um,
fascinating.
yeah, that's actually it's a very common theme in accessibility, that it's not about adding as much information for the screen reader user as possible. It's about adding the right amount of information. Because this is a good example of it is technically accurate information. It's just unnecessary. It's excessively verbose. It doesn't ultimately help. So I'm
Okay.
going to look at a second site that is
Right.
also a good accessible navigation menu, and that's the current whitehouse.gov. Now, this was obviously a pretty significant build. This was worked on heavily by people closely involved in the WordPress community. And it's again also very solid. And one of the things I particularly like about it is the fact that they actually use the word menu in their menu button. So it has a text menu. But it also kind of uses the motif of the three horizontal lines
Oh,
that
it
are
does.
common as the
Yeah.
hamburger menu. So it's a really nice way for me, of giving it both that sense of a hamburger menu, but also actually having text. It's elegant.
Nice.
But this is also a menu that works well from the keyboard. It's much more significant because it's a mega menu sort of style. It's
Hmm.
modally replacing everything. Um, but it's got pretty clear focus state. It's not the best. That dotted outline it's okay. It's not great. But there's so much content here that it's really critical that this navigation works well and that you can separate between these top level links and all of the section content that's within them. So this is a good example of a really complex navigation menu. And what I just did is I tabbed all the way through the items.
Yep.
And when I ended, I had returned to this close button.
Oh,
So
nice.
what
Okay.
that's demonstrating is that this menu, which is behaving in a modal fashion by covering all content, is also constraining focus so that your focus doesn't accidentally just leave this menu and you don't lose that visible track of where you are. So that's a great one. And it'll be very interesting in a couple of weeks to take a look at what the next version is like.
Just on that point, so obviously this is a government website, and it feels like certainly in the UK, the gov.uk website feels like it's in the vanguard in UK accessibility, at least anyway, of doing a good job. And I'm guessing that legislation in the US, obviously that's where you're living, I'm in the
Mhm.
UK, it compels websites to be accessible by, but not just because it's a moral argument, but because it literally has to be. Because, this might be the difference between somebody, I don't know, getting their child to school, registered with a school or not, that kind of thing. So the law kind of backing it up. And in this case, the White House sort of showing how it's done. That's nice.
Yes. And that is absolutely true here that government websites are definitely required to be accessible. But there's a deep reality that they're being required to be accessible only technically requires them to meet very specific guidelines, and they aren't necessarily being reviewed on a day-to-day basis. Um, and I always tell people that meeting guidelines, meeting the web content accessibility guidelines, is just meeting the minimum allowed.
Right. Interesting. Yeah.
That doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily constitute making a good accessible website. There's a lot more you can do to make sure that everything is actually good and effective. And that's kind of an example of like that extra verbosity in those navigation menus. Now, in that particular case, because the two labels are actually different, you can argue that there's an actual accessibility problem there. But technically, verbosity, having all of this extra verbiage, that's not an accessibility failure. It's an inconvenience. It's something that you can do to make things better. But I mean,
Okay.
there's nothing technically wrong with telling somebody twice that it's a navigation region.
Yeah, I guess it just becomes a bit irritating, doesn't it? If
Exactly.
it's just a little bit too
It's kind
much.
of that difference between really having a good user experience and having a possible user experience.
Right. Okay. Okay, so there they were, childrensrights.org and whitehouse.gov. Again, they'll be linked in the show notes so that you can go and find those, but the URLs came on the screen if you're able to see that. And okay, now we'll move on to something which is important. I guess I'll just
Uh-huh.
remove the screen just for a moment. The web would be a very uninteresting place if we didn't have forms. It would
And
basically be like magazines which changed in front of your eyes. You wouldn't really be able to do anything. Web 2.0 and social networks and all of that certainly couldn't have come around. They are, apart from images, videos, and text, they are kind of the bedrock of so much that we do online.
they're the
And
bedrock of what makes websites useful tools, I
yeah,
think. I mean, as
that's
an
right.
information source, everything else is great. But in terms of actually being able to interact, all of our shopping, all of our signups, registrations, event management, so many things are driven by having these forms. Um, so having them be accessible, that is valuable, I
And
would say.
we know that in the WordPress space, there is a ton of solutions. You basically purchase something or get something for free, you install it, and you're good to go. So I don't know if we'll get into that particularly, which options there are, but nevertheless, forms,
Yeah.
websites, here we go. So where are we going to start? We're going to
We're going to
start.
start at the Webby Awards.
Okay.
Now, I kind of love using an awards site as a demo for this. Because, of course, you know, this is a thing that's really well known in the accessibility community, is that most big web awards do not take accessibility into consideration at all. And that's also true about the WordPress showcase, which is where all of these sites are being drawn from, is that they don't currently really consider accessibility as a factor in any of the submissions,
I
which is
mean,
one of
would
the
it be
reasons that
fair
they're
to
a good
say,
source.
in a sense? Sorry, Joe. I think I
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
cross-talked you there.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, would it be fair to say that really things like the Webby Awards? I know it has a reputation really for demonstrating clever new things that we
Hmm.
can do inside a browser. So animations, clever design, which really it looks great. It's almost like you're looking at a Hollywood movie in some cases. But whether it serves the audience that this show is trying to serve, maybe not.
Right. Well, I mean, there's first of all, there's a distinction, and there should be a distinction between uh, a site that is specifically intended to explore stretching the boundaries,
Yeah,
and a site that's intended to communicate. Just the other day there was an article posted on WordPress.org about needing more weird themes,
I saw that.
and
Yeah.
that spawned an enormous amount of conversation. And personally speaking, I don't have any problem with there being weird themes, um, because one of the fundamental areas where themes have so many problems is honestly in the just the basic technological framework, like not having labeled buttons and not having labeled inputs and not having uh, functional navigation menus. And I don't care how weird a theme is if it functionally just works.
Right.
That's the bar I want to focus on raising. What I also think is that the WordPress theme directory needs a better ability to distinguish between things that are really suitable for a commercial professional environment and things that are um, more flavor. They're like a personal site can be as weird as it wants to be, and that's fine. I don't have any problem with that. um, if you are preventing a close friend from seeing your information, that's between you and them.
Right. Right.
If you are preventing a potential customer from obtaining your widgets, that might be a bigger problem.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
But at
Interesting.
any rate, I think that what the Webby Awards do is, in many cases, just fine. Like, let's award people stretching boundaries.
Right.
The the whole way that standards and like browser support develops over time is based on people taking something that's just an idea in the specification that's not even got real implementation and saying, "Oh, let's implement this and see how it works." And that can sometimes lead to things like the Internet Explorer Netscape wars, where each browser implemented radically different ways of doing things, and it's a nightmare. But it can
Mm,
also mean that a really necessary tool gets fleshed out, explored, experimented with until it's actually useful. So I think there's a lot of places for all of these things.
okie doke. Yeah. Webby Awards, I think, has a reputation for being eye candy. Essentially, that's kind of
Right.
how I see it. But here we are. Let
So
me just
let's take a
Webby.
look
Yeah. Go
at
for it.
their newsletter sign up form. So all of what I'm looking at here is newsletter signups. And one of the
Okay.
reasons I'm doing that is because there are two forms common on websites that are among the simplest possible types of forms: search and newsletters. Like almost every website is going to have a pretty simple version of doing that. Can't scroll. Why can't I scroll? Oh, because
You move the
I couldn't
mouse away.
scroll because I was clicking on the screen share that's in the video.
I do that.
Like, what's going on? I feel like a moron. But okay, scroll my way down to their very, very, very buried newsletter sign up form. It's way down
Okay.
here at the bottom. No criticism of that. That's none of my business. That's marketing. But okay, so here we are. We've got um, something that looks like a heading. We've got a form field that is somewhat visible. We've got a terms and conditions checkbox with microscopic print and a giant sign up button. So let's look at what we've actually got going on here. So, okay, first of all, stay in touch is a label. It's not
Okay.
associated with anything. So it's not labeling anything. It's just is a label. So semantically, it's effectively plain text. That would be called an orphaned label. So, okay, what's next? We've got another label, which appears to be positioned right behind the form field. And based on its classes, it says newsletter error, and it's empty. So presumably this is a container where they're going to stick an error if you trigger an error using this form.
Right.
Currently, it's present and empty. It has an ID on it.
It's a
I'm not
long
sure what that's
ID.
for. Yeah. And then there's a third label, which is for success. So they got a completely separate container to hit a success menu, a success response. But none
Gosh.
of those labels at this point are being used for anything. Now we get to the actual form field and we have an input, but this input does not have a label.
Oh God.
So they're making a lot of use of the label element, but none of them are being used correctly. So the end result is a field that isn't labeled. It has a placeholder. So there is some degree of information. For a screen reader, that would still be used as information. For a sighted user, once you've entered any information in this field, it's no longer visible. And because there's no distinction between the color of actual text and the placeholder, there's not really any way of distinguishing what
Right.
state this is in. So there's a lot going on here. Let's continue on. We've got this two field sets.
Yeah.
So a field set is used to group related
Grouping.
inputs.
Yeah.
So if you've got like for a newsletter sign up form, say if you've taken a name and an email and interests, for example, that might be a logical group. The sign up button is not a group. And the single checkbox for terms and conditions is not a group. So I don't see that that's serving any purpose. These are just unnecessary things. And there is a label on the checkbox anyway, so it has got a label. It's an implicit label, which is not always the best choice, but it does work. It's mostly fine. And then, of course, if you try and sign up, you do get an error message here. So now,
Okay. That label is now being co-opted in here. Okay.
well, it's associated with something,
Yeah.
um, but it doesn't have a for attribute. So it's not actually associated with the input. It's just another label.
Yep.
It's not associated with the error, with the field that actually has an error at all. Additionally, this red on black is not going to meet color contrast specifications. So it's definitely not going to be very visible.
So
And finally,
go on. You finish, and then I'll ask
I
you my
got one
question.
more
Sorry. Yeah.
thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
This input, so a newsletter sign up is an incredibly standard field. It's something that should always contain the same information, pretty much. If you're signing up for a newsletter, it should contain your email address.
Right.
So this is a great candidate for using an autocomplete field with a standard autocomplete attribute provides your email address. It doesn't use that. Now, for a lot of people, just typing out their email address is not a big deal. But for people with considerable mobility impairments, for example, typing can be very labor intensive. If you're using, say, a sip and puff system to do binary entry of your email address, it's kind of like, using one of those television interfaces where you have to select each letter
Yeah.
at the
Yeah.
various
Yeah.
point in a
Perfect.
grid.
That's a
It's a
great
similar
illustration.
process.
Yeah.
It's tedious, it's hard work, and when there's an autocomplete attribute, it can all just be automatically populated with your own information.
So just a couple of things on that. Firstly, the autocomplete attribute enables the browser to sort of inject pre-saved um, content into there. So
Exactly.
yeah, so you might have your browser, in this case Firefox, you may have saved your email address or your address,
Right.
or I guess you can go as far as credit card numbers, whatever. It's all
Right.
there ready to put in. And for me, I do that all the time. I just click the one
Absolutely.
button, and it just all the fields get filled in. And this doesn't allow it because it simply doesn't know it exists.
Right.
So my other question then, on a scale
Now,
of
I
sort of
will
like
say
one, oh,
it's a little bit of
go
a
on.
stretch to say it doesn't allow it. It's not preventing
Sorry,
it.
right?
And browsers do try and detect these fields and say, "Oh, I think I know what you probably
Right.
want here."
Thank you. Yeah.
So it will still potentially do that. It's just that it's not nearly as certain. And
Yeah.
one of the things that the autocomplete attribute allows you to do is, um, in particular, when it comes to things like usernames and passwords, is it can distinguish between new username and old username.
Right.
So will it autofill with something that is actually what you want, or is it expected to produce a new username? Because that's an important distinction.
Yeah.
You don't want
Yeah.
to be populating for especially with passwords. You don't want to be populating an existing password in a new password field.
Yeah, thank you. Good point. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how frustrating would this be for somebody, let's say, using a screen reader? How would you be able to somehow get your way through it, or is this a total zero? You got no chance.
So I think you'd absolutely be able to get through it.
Uh-huh.
Um, and that has a lot to do with the fact that it is very standard information. And if you're reading through the page in a line by line fashion, you are going to encounter this text, stay in touch, and you're going to encounter,
Yeah. Yeah.
the text that says, by checking the box, I agree and consent and sign up. And you'll be able to figure out that it's a newsletter sign up.
Got it.
Um,
Okay.
it's just, it's not doing you any favors at all in terms of just making it clear and easy. Everything is going to have to require some work to figure it out. And that's kind of the point of where it becomes a problem. It's unnecessary work.
Okay. Okay. So there we go. That was the Webby Awards and their
Indeed.
not contact form, their sign up form. Next one, I don't even know how to say this.
I don't know how
Uh,
to say this either.
Diabla Outdoor, I'm guessing.
Yeah,
Diabla.
that's what I would probably have gone
Yeah.
with.
Okay. All right. So
So this is
diablaoutdoor.com.
it's a series, I think it's outdoor furniture.
Okay.
It's
Looks
interesting. It's very striking red and white design.
yeah.
They also have put their newsletter sign up way at the bottom of the page. Or at least they had when I looked at them before.
They detected that you were going to have your beady eye on it. They've removed it
I
from the
wonder if it's
page.
not visible in this
Yeah. If it is,
form.
we'll just move on because that's
Let me
interesting.
look. Oh, yeah.
There,
It's
there it
not
is.
visible with the inspector open.
Is that just because the inspector is crunching the viewport down to something more
Yeah,
narrow?
I'd say that it's
Okay.
just being hidden when the viewport becomes that narrow. So I guess
Yeah.
that's an issue to be aware of, is if you're visiting the site on mobile, you can't sign up for the newsletter.
Interesting.
Or maybe
That's a
it might be that it's just getting moved into their drop-down menu or something.
yeah, I was gonna say that's
I'm not going to
sometimes a
explore
choice.
that because it's not super relevant.
No. Okay.
But okay, so there are a lot of things I hate about what's currently on the screen. First on that list is the fact that almost everything is in all caps.
I was just about
And
to say,
that drives me nuts. That is
it's very
actually an
shouty.
accessibility problem because that's going to really create some issues for people with reading impairments. Um, like the ability to distinguish between letters goes way down with all caps because the shapes are less differentiated. And it's just a little overwhelming. I feel like this page is shouting at me.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Can't even think why. Genuinely, I don't see why you do that.
I don't
I
know why you
don't,
do
there
it.
you go.
No.
Yeah.
Anyhow, but then additionally to that, this particular shade of red creates a color contrast problem. So that is going to be a problem everywhere. But it's even worse in the actual form itself. Oh
Hmm.
yeah, I can't inspect things.
No, you're gonna have
Right.
to do it from
That's
memory,
fine.
I'm afraid. Yeah.
Uh, because this is actually slightly more washed out. This red, it's probably being made slightly opaque. I don't know. I can see that the subscribe button has been made disabled, and so it's a little paler. And so they're all very difficult to see. It's a very low contrast. Now, this one has no labels at all on
No,
either this
not a thing.
checkbox or on this field. Um, this is again using a placeholder. So there's some degree of visible information, but not much. Uh, but this radio button here, I'm calling it a radio button because it's round. It is not a radio button. It is in fact a checkbox that's been redesigned to look like a radio button.
Oh,
And then this text is not a label associated with it, so there's nothing there to make an association. Uh, it doesn't throw an error if you fail to check the box. So you can try and subscribe, and it doesn't throw an error. Oh, that's right. What it does do is it actually recognizes that that's a fake email.
oh, interesting. That's time well spent.
Um, so anyway, it's interesting. There's no focus states, so you can't tell where you are at any point. Um,
Oh,
it
look at that. It just goes all solid red.
Yeah, it goes solid red. That
Oh, God.
technically, if it weren't for the fact that the color fundamentally fails color contrast, that would be a pretty reasonable
Yeah,
checked state.
yeah.
Um, the error messages, if you do manage to throw them, are microscopic. Let me see. I should try and throw one.
Oh, I'm sorry. Just can you use like a disposable email somewhere? I can,
I can use one that isn't real.
yeah, do that.
I have to try and remember, how did I actually throw an error here? Because maybe if I uncheck that. No, that's no. Maybe if there we go. That'll throw an error.
Oh, oh yeah,
There.
there you go.
There it is. Teeny tiny little error. Now, and it's also underneath the
Yeah,
form
it's
field
it's
by quite a bit.
totally divorced from the rest of the form, isn't
It's
it?
difficult to find, and it is
Yeah.
microscopic. So, it is a frustrating thing. This form I think would be more frustrating than the previous one. It has a lot of very similar characteristics, but like the contrast issues are considerably worse because it's literally everything. So if you can't see this color combination, well, honestly, you can't use this website if you can't see this color
Yeah.
combination.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, it's a disaster, but it's going to be just so frustrating. You can't tell where you are. There's no labels. I found this to be pretty frustrating,
Yeah, it is pretty frustrating.
but it is
Um,
basically the same set of problems as the other one. It doesn't have all of the kind of weird semantics. Um, so yeah, it is all hidden.
okay.
Give
It
me a
is all
second.
hidden. Yeah, never mind. Should we try the next one?
Sure, let's just go on.
Right. So the next one is slightly longer URL. I'll read it out in case you don't go to the show notes. This next one is or I don't know how to say this either. Orchestra, I guess, with an E, not an A at the end. Orchestra Metropolitane .com
Yeah.
/en/newsletter. I'm guessing this is I'm going to say French, maybe, or something.
Yeah, I
I
believe it's
don't know.
French. I'm
Okay.
on the English version of the website,
Yeah,
but
hence the URL, but links in the show notes. All right, so it's for an orchestra, the
right.
Metropolitan Orchestra,
Well,
I'm
first of
guessing.
all, yeah, and that would be my assumption.
Yeah.
So first of all, they have a link to subscribe to the newsletter at the top of the page. So that's kind of nice. It's a little bit easier to just jump to it. It is on a separate page. It's not, buried someplace. And here it is. This is a little more complicated. It's got multiple fields. But this is using one of those kind of floating labeling things, which
Oh,
can
you
be,
put it focus on it, and it sort of moves the label out of the
yeah.
text area into
I
where
mean,
the
there
label
are
should
worse
be.
things than that,
Yeah.
because at least the label is persistent, even if it does move around. However, this label field is, as many of them have been on these simple forms, not associated with the input field. So as you can see here, it's a label, but it has no for attribute, no ID attributes that are associated with the input. So effectively, it's not really labeled. And this is actually worse than the other ones because it doesn't use a placeholder. And so therefore, because this label is not explicitly associated and it doesn't use a placeholder, these input fields have no labels at all. So for a screen reader
Oh,
user, this is just a text input. It's just going to say text. There's no additional information.
oh, it's like a
So
black hole.
while for a sighted user, this has actually got a little bit of a better experience because it's not using a placeholder and is using this label. Because the label is incorrectly used, it's worse for a screen reader user.
Got it.
So that's annoying. Now, this positioning animation could be disorienting for somebody with issues revolving around animation. It's relatively minor. It might fit into a pretty subtle window of what's allowable. There's no focus state on the submit button, so we kind of try and navigate to the submit button. Oh, that's right. I was going to mention that. I've just shown you something I was intending to show you later. But the important thing here is I'm navigating. I can see where I am because of the cursor position and the disappearance of the label on the
Yeah.
form fields.
Yeah.
But then the submit button has no state. So I can't be sure that I've actually managed to tab to the submit button, which is frustrating. This
Gosh.
again has these error messages that are small. They have very poor color contrast. And once again, there is no reference to the error message in the input field. So ideally, all of these error messages would be associated using something like Aria described by, so that they are explicitly associated with the field they're relevant to, but none of them do. They are just, this one happens to just be a div with no particular reference. It has a wrapping ID attribute, which is the thing that would be needed for an Aria described by to work. Because Aria described by, you would attach that attribute to the input. It would be Aria described by equals an ID attribute, and that ID attribute would be the container that has the description that you want to refer to. With that in place, if a user gets to that email field, they can see, oh, I hear that there's an additional piece of information, which is that the email field is required.
Got it.
Now, of course, a newsletter form is very simple. It is common to, of course, you assume that the email field is a required field in a newsletter form. But the point of this is that despite the fact that this is a very simple form, people do this all the time on much more complicated forms where it's not so easy to assume as well. This is
Right.
just kind of a
Right.
microcosm of all of the different problems you see as a regular basis.
That error text is profoundly hard to read. That
It is
is,
very difficult,
yeah,
yes.
yeah, yeah.
And the other thing here is that the email input is required. The name inputs are not required.
Right.
And there's no way to distinguish
You
between them.
can't,
But just reading that,
yeah,
you can't
yeah.
tell that some of these fields are required and not all of them. And that's true in both the code and in the visible. Like there's
Hmm.
nothing about
No.
any of these fields that tells you explicitly which ones are required. You just have to guess. And
Hmm.
then that other thing that I accidentally exposed is that this whole site has a funky thing about adjusting its viewport position. It's essentially, I think what it's trying to do is always keep your current focus centered. And it's kind of
Oh,
maddening, especially if what you've done is you've scrolled manually to read something. You're like, oh, I wanted to see this. And then you just tab up here. As soon as you hit tab, it moves everything around and it hides what you maybe were trying to see.
so let me just understand. If you tab into a particular, like in the form field, it decides that it wants to put that 50% from north to south of the viewport. Just
Yeah,
wants
I
to
haven't
be in
looked
the.
at the actual code, but that
Oh,
is, yeah, that's what I've concluded that it's doing.
that is unusual, isn't it? It's like some sort of
Yeah,
writer's focus mode or something, but
kind
I've
of,
never
yeah.
seen that before.
But it's the kind of thing that while it sounds good, it's taking control away from the user.
Yeah,
Like
you've
if
lost all
you really
agency, haven't
wanted
you?
to
Yeah,
be able to
yeah.
see two things at once, if you really wanted to be able to say, like, this isn't a good example, but if there was an information field and you wanted to be able to copy some information from elsewhere on the site into it, good luck. It's
That
going to
is
keep
such
moving
a
you around.
that is such an unusual decision. Like,
Yeah,
I wonder who thought that was a good idea. We don't normally say it in quite so stark terms, but that does seem like a poor. I
it's
cannot
very
think of a.
intentional and
Yeah,
unusual.
yeah,
So
that's
it's
unusual.
interesting.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
can see some argument for it. It's like I can see that you can imagine that there's some benefit to having that centered. For somebody with low vision, there's something to be said for not having to readjust their location, for example.
Okay. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I think the disorientation of unexpected movement is considerably more of a problem than the very minor potential benefits of being able to keep in a fixed position. Um, I would definitely call this more annoying than beneficial.
Yeah. I'm with you. I'm with you.
All right.
Okay,
Last
so that
one.
was whoa, that was quite something. But it feels like, from what you wrote in our shared show notes, it feels like this is going to take us to entirely new levels. Um, Here we go. Now, this one is called Now New Next dot fuego camina conmigo.com.
Yes.
That's an easy to say. Links in the show notes. And if you can see it, it's on the screen as well. Oh boy.
I'm trying to remember where the newsletter is.
Yeah, there's a lot
If
of
you're
animation
watching, what you're
here.
seeing is that this is nonstop animation. It changes
Yeah.
color as you scroll. It's got all sorts of weird things that just kind of move around on the screen.
Yeah, it's like
Um,
candidate for a
it's a
Webby,
lot.
basically.
Yeah. So interesting, but a bit of a nightmare. All
Oh,
right.
there
And
it
again,
is.
we've got
There
their
it is.
newsletter down at the really way at the bottom. Now, one thing you'll notice is that they've got this uh, extra cursor dot that kind of follows your mouse cursor around. This is a thing that I find really irritating.
What's the point of that? I've seen that once or twice in my life, and each time I think, "Why? What's
Yeah.
the point?"
Well, and honestly, I've seen them in various cases where they're much more complex than this. Like this is just a little black dot um, about the same size as a mouse cursor. I don't see what the point is of it.
It's a gimmick, isn't it?
It's a
That I mean,
gimmick.
it
Yeah,
really does feel like we're just saying, "Look what we can do. We've got
exactly.
more animation than you have."
So the newsletter itself, um, first of all, it has the same problems we've seen in many occasions. There's no label. Um, it's using a placeholder. That's about it. But then it gets a little bit interesting. So first of all, obviously, what you're expecting here is you'll enter your email, and then this button that doesn't have a focus state. Um, you would assume visually that this is going to submit the form,
The
wouldn't you?
little arrow, that's what I'm
Yeah.
assuming. That's the
So it
submit
has an
button.
Aria label on it, and it says open newsletter form.
Oh gosh.
So
Oh,
for a screen
oh.
reader user, first of all, that's what this says it's going to do. So what does it actually do? Oh, it in fact does open a newsletter form. So this is actually something where the screen reader is getting a lot more information than the sighted user who expects that they're done at this point. So, all right, we've opened this form. Now, obviously, you can see that the color here is changing over time.
Oh.
So there's an animation going on. You can also see that there's this intense gradient. So, like the color contrast is mostly horrific and sometimes not, but it's highly variable. It depends on which moment you actually see this. It's a bit maddening. Now, I'm just going to start tabbing through to see if I can figure out where I am. Well, now I know you can't see anything, um, but it's pretty random. Like here, I've gotten to the input field, but the tab stuff before that was a Facebook link.
Really?
Yep. Now I'll show you where we are. So I'm going to close this. So the next links here are Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook. What happens
Oh.
when you open this is you are not moved. So
Oh.
first you go to Instagram, then you go to LinkedIn, then you go to Facebook because those are the next links in the footer. But the form has been inserted after the footer. It's at the end of the page. So it's not a very long journey to get there. However, when you open a modal, you should be landed in the modal. It's just a good fortune that this was relatively easy to get to.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh god.
so that's exciting. Now, in the form itself, so let's look at what we've got here. Um, this is still the same issue with the input. It still has a placeholder and doesn't have a label. It's got a couple of additional checkboxes. So these do have a label and it is associated. So that's great. But the entirety of the label is a link. Now, what that means is that when you click on this label, it will take you to the link. So you can't use clicking on the label to check the checkbox.
Oh, you have to check the little circle.
Right. You actually have to check the circle.
Oh, wow.
And of course, this is another example that is a checkbox that's remapped itself to look like a radio button. So it gives you the,
Yeah.
but it's worse because now there's two of them. So you have the impression that even more of an impression that they look like a radio pattern, but they're actually not. But that's true for both of these, that the entirety of the label is a link. In general, it's not a great practice to have links inside a label. It's not like going to be the end of the world if a link is just some portion. It's common in like terms of service or privacy policies that the word privacy policy is linked. But it's a real problem if the entire text is a link, because now you cannot click on that label. And one of the big points of having that label associated is so that you can click on it. It gives you a larger click target. So that's annoying. The actual checkbox labels, I would argue, are not very helpful. Like, I'm not clear what exactly you are checking here. Like this text essentially is saying subscription, newsletter, now, new, next.
Right, right.
So by checking this, do you have to check this to be subscribed? What's the point of having a subscription form where there's a possible way you can do it without subscribing?
Yeah.
I
God.
just don't understand the purpose of that. Um, and then the other one it's just the text privacy policy. It does not say you are agreeing to their privacy
Agreeing.
policy. You're just recognizing, oh, this is a privacy policy.
Yeah,
So those labels
yeah.
aren't really great. And then additionally, there are none of these fields have any kind of focus state. So there's nothing here that you can navigate with the keyboard and see a focus state.
Oh gosh.
So this one honestly drove me nuts.
This
I
gets
will
the
additionally
award.
say, so this subscription button,
Yeah.
well, the visible label is Quiero suscribirme, which is appropriate. The Aria label, however, is subscribe to newsletter.
Right.
This is one of the problems with using an Aria label is people omit them when translating.
Yeah, and there it is.
Like,
Because it's
it's
not
a
on the screen,
constant
you don't
problem.
see it. Yeah,
And
yeah.
there's no reason to have an Aria label on anything that has visible text. Um, I mean, there's occasionally some justification because you need to elaborate on that slightly. This is common in like read more links, is that the visible text is just read more. Actual text might be read more name of article. And that's reasonable. But this is just awful because this is basically means, especially for a native Spanish speaker who doesn't speak English, this is going to be pronounced with a weird accent because it's going to be pronounced in Spanish pronunciation, the text subscribe to newsletter, which they want to
Yeah,
avoid.
yeah, which nobody
So
nobody's wanting to hear.
it's a whole bunch of fun.
It definitely gets the award, the Ig Nobel Prize
Yeah.
for forms on today's show. So I mean, what else is there to say? We had really couple
Yeah.
of really nice navigations at the start there, followed by 4 examples of perhaps how not to do
How not
uh,
to do a newsletter subscribe
a
form. Yes,
simple
indeed.
one field, typically newsletter subscribe form. As I said, I'll post the links into the show notes. Next time, Joe has mooted that for episode 4, which is the one following this. Maybe we'll spend a bit of time looking at something akin to the newsletter subscribe form, but done right. Uh,
Exactly.
we'll
That's the
tease
goal.
that and leave it there. But a pleasure as always, Joe. Thank you so
Oh,
much.
yeah,
Just
thank
before we
you.
go, where can we find you? Where would people get in
Well,
touch with you these days?
you can find me on Blue Sky. Uh, I'm joedolson.com or joedolson.bsky.social. You can find me at my website, joedolson.com. You can find me on wordpress.org at profiles.wordpress.org/joedolson. And you can chat with me on Slack.
Nice. Blue Sky seems to be the where everybody's ending up. Just out of interest, I know it's apropos of nothing. How does Blue Sky do from an
Oh,
accessibility?
accessibility wise?
Yeah.
They're mixed.
Okay.
I mean, I haven't, I mean, I don't think they've done a lot of development lately because I think they've been doing
Just
more
swamped.
desperate trying to keep themselves
Yeah.
running.
Ramping up the
But I
servers
know
and things.
they have some issues, but they have some really good things as well. Like one of the things they have is they have a setting within their configuration where you can have alt text be required
Yeah,
to
I've
add a photo.
enabled that. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And the great thing about that is that there are actually a lot of people who intend to do this, but just don't always remember.
Yeah.
And that's a good way of just being like, it's just a good reminder. I also really like their actual interface for adding that alt text. Like it is really making a point of explaining what this is and why you need it. And, I feel like that's a thing they're doing pretty well.
Yeah, they
Obviously, a lot of
explain what the
people,
point is, don't they? It's good.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's more than just, turn this on and then you just got to fend for yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, it's nice. I'm over there as well. I'm at, well, nathanwrigley.com, so same thing as Joe, but nathanwrigley.com. And that's another feature. You can add your own domain. Anyway, that's
Yeah,
apropos
the
of
the
nothing.
do your own domain thing is interesting though because of the way the redirection works.
Oh.
Like if you use your own domain and had previously used it without your own domain, that those old links will not redirect to your new domain, and somebody else could
Oh.
actually take that username. So somebody could become joedolson.bsky.social. So what I've actually done, I am
You've got 'em
using
both.
joedolson.bsky.social, but I did set up the domain redirect because it does work the other way around.
Got it. Got it.
So people can go to joedolson.com and it will redirect to joedolson.bsky.social.
They've made it a policy now that if you from now on, if you sign up, and because you have to sign up with a bluesky.social at the moment username.
Yeah.
If you then move on to claim your domain, they reserve that domain, the handle that you previously had.
Ah,
That now
that's
is
good.
yours. Yeah, so it's a new feature.
That's a good change. That was
Yeah,
something that when I was first setting that up and looked that up, I was like, oh, I don't really like that. That
yeah,
just
it
means that I
wasn't
can set
ideal.
up an identity and then somebody can pirate it.
I imagine that they just never thought that that was a thing, and now somebody pointed it
Yeah.
out, and so they've taken the steps
Yeah.
to. Anyway,
Good.
Joe, honestly, thank you so much for joining me once again. Really appreciate it. We'll be back for episode 4 at some point in
Yeah.
the near future, but for now, take care. Have a
Take
nice
care.
day.
Thank you
See you
very
soon.
much. See
Bye.
you later.
Bye.
Bye
Bye.
bye.